Cornish Review, which we've been trying to get our hands on. So.
Yeah, I've got some copies. I've got loads more at home. I'd have brought them all.
What's the stage of that?
Oh, that's nothing to do with me. I bought it second hand.
On the back of this it says, Mrs. R, my bedroom is ready if you feel it.
Those are the kind of people that read the Cornish Review. Okay, well I'll start then. Okay, so my talk's mainly, it's called States of Mind, that was, but it's kind of really about it's kind of the history of Cornwall in the 60s and some of the interesting things that were happening then, so I've kind of subtitled it Cornwall at the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius. I should say that I'm a doctor by trade, that's how I pay my mortgage, but I also have taken a special interest in Cornish culture and Cornish arts, and I've run the online magazine artcornwall.org for more than 10 years, and I've written a few books as well. And the two books that are most relevant to the talk today are Folk in Cornwall, which is a history of the folk clubs and folk singers that worked down in Cornwall, sang down in Cornwall, and The Re-Enchanted Landscape, which is more about the sacred sites and the way in which pagans and people involved in the Earth Mysteries movement responded to Cornwall, and particularly West Cornwall and this part of West Cornwall. And really the talk's structured around some of the ideas in those books, but also particularly around this place and Boscawen Un, where we're going a bit later. So, first thing to say, just to get it, so we can move on and don't dwell too much on it. Probably to a lot of people, St Buryan is kind of famous as the location of Straw Dogs, which is a film made in 1971. Did you do something on that this morning, by any chance? Okay, that's good. So, it's a very interesting depiction of Cornwall. It's completely shot in this part of Cornwall. It was made in 1971. Dustin Hoffman was a star. Dustin Hoffman in 1971 had just made The Graduate, so he was, and that's the film that made him famous. So he was a sort of A-list celebrity when he came to Cornwall to make this film. And but it's famous because it's very violent and there's a rape scene in the middle, which is very controversial. And as a consequence, it was banned for about 20 years. In this country, it was illegal to own it or to distribute it or to watch it or anything else because of the various legislation that was passed in the 80s. It was a video nasty. I don't know if you remember back to that time. But it's a good film and very thought-provoking. And so probably as you drove through St Buryan, you didn't necessarily notice. Did anyone notice this house that's got a corner cut off it? This is the opening scene of the film. And it's very distinctive. So on the left here is the church. The church tower here, and there's a building in the square there that was sort of the background to this opening scene. The opening scene's got the main character, Dustin Hoffman, who plays a mathematician. He's a sort of very geeky, kind of scientific mathematician working for a university, I think in New York. He's very urbane, very cosmopolitan. And he meets his wife, who's from Cornwall. His wife introduces him to his Cornish friends. His Cornish friends are, let's say, less cultured, less educated, and there's this kind of conflict that runs through the whole film, which ends up in him killing about four or five Cornishmen. So it's pretty brutal. But the thing that's, I think, important about it is it's very much about how Cornwall is different somehow. It feels quite remote. Sometimes it's difficult to put your finger on what it is that makes it different, but some of that sense of it being remote from civilization, if you like, is really celebrated or explored in this film. So moving on from Straw Dogs to the Cornish Review, because I think actually what's interesting is the Cornish Review in its own way does the same thing. I think what's nice about the Cornish Review, important about the Cornish Review, is it helped create a sense that Cornwall was somehow separate and had its own kind of culture and its own type of way of looking at the world. And for me, that's kind of what's most interesting and most important about the Cornish Review. And I think you're all sort of familiar, you've heard of it presumably. The editor, Dennis Valbaker, is quite an interesting character, and I thought I'd talk a bit about him and his family, because actually his family were quite interesting as well. So there was that period in the beginning of the 60s where the Cornish Review was out of print, but Dennis Valbaker, the editor, was putting all his efforts into writing novels, and he wrote I think 6 or 7 novels that are basically autobiographical and about his family and the various adventures they got up to. They were quite sort of chaotic, bohemian type family that had lots of kind of slightly unconventional ways. This is a rather nice picture from a book from 1963 called The Door Is Always Open, which I have a copy here. You can tell by the cover, it's kind of middle brow, kind of populist kind of writing about Cornwall. And the picture is quite telling because Dennis Val Baker was aiming for a populist audience. He wasn't very overt about his politics, but actually he was quite left-wing, and he was very involved with CND in Cornwall, hence the CND logo on the front of the house. And so in 1963, that's quite radical. But it was also the time when CND there were a lot of marches. The Aldermaston marches were happening in the early 60s, and there were lots of protests at Trafalgar Square and so on. And so Dennis Val Baker would organise for coaches to go up from Cornwall with people protesting at the CND marches. And in the meantime, this is Porthmeor Beach near the Tate. So their house. Well, I was talking about this house, St Christopher's. Backed onto the beach, and they would serve tea and coffee and things out of the back to the tourists on the beach when they weren't helping organise these marches. And so there's a very nice photo of a CND march in 1964. And what's interesting about it is that this is Martin Val Baker. This is another one of the Val Bakers. So these are all young people from Cornwall leading the march. And so it's kind of interesting that there was this connection, and you wouldn't know it like reading the Cornish Review or reading his books, particularly because he doesn't talk about it. Which leads us to thinking about kind of some of the things that were happening culturally at the beginning of the 60s. And I think of particular relevance is the fact that the Beatnik movement, to a large extent in this country, sort of coalesced around the protest movement, the CND movement. And so, again, what's interesting about this picture, they're all young people in that picture. And they would all, most of them would be to describe themselves as Beatniks. And certainly Martin Val Baker at that time would have described himself as a Beatnik. And it's a bit of a cliche, but the Beatniks name themselves after the Beat poets, or were named, I should say. Which I'm sure you're aware of, and again, it's a cliche, but the people I've spoken to around the 60s remember Beatniks walking around with copies of On the Road in their back pocket and that sort of stuff. I think they really did do it. And there's another picture. And the other thing that was interesting about the Beatnik movement is that they obviously picked up on folk music, because the folk music revival of the 60s wouldn't have happened without the Beatniks sort of championing it. The Beatniks were originally interested in jazz, but they've got more into folk music in the early 60s and started playing acoustic guitars. And again, acoustic guitars, we take them for granted now, they're sort of everywhere, but in the early 60s they weren't commonly available or commonly played by anybody really. And there's a guy called Whiz Jones who became known as King of the Beatniks, playing in Trafalgar Square, and he's another one that came down to Cornwall. And in fact, in 1960, Alan Wickham made a documentary about the Beatniks in Cornwall. Basically, there was something romantic about hitching to somewhere like Cornwall, and hordes of them of Beatniks would hitch down to Cornwall and sleep on the beaches, and sleep rough, basically. And hence that's why Alan Wickham made this documentary in 1960. And the same thing happened in St Ives. St Ives, there was a harbour wall that was called the Beatnik Wall, and you can see this. If you can see them that clearly, there's obviously 2 young men there. One of them with quite long hair. There's 3 or 4 behind. They're all the same sort of age. They would have all hitched down, and they would all be sleeping on the beaches. And they would meet at this wall in St Ives, which has since been knocked down, and the St Ives Town Council knocked it down precisely to try and discourage Beatniks from meeting there. It's just running all around the harbour. I think they initially tried to make it uncomfortable for them, so they added sort of bricks and things on top, and that didn't work, so they just knocked it down completely. So another interesting episode in relation to the Beatniks was there was rumours that all sorts of people came down to Cornwall and came down to St Ives at that time, but one person we know definitely came down to Cornwall at that time was Donovan, the singer. And there's a link to the Val Bakers again. So the Val Bakers, remember, living in St Ives, they are Beatniks, so of course that they befriend Donovan. And so this is a picture of the Val Baker family. There's certainly two Val Bakers here. That's Jane Val Baker, who's involved in Portsmouth here actually.
Yes.
One of the volunteers there.
She's the one of our trust.
She's got photos of Donovan that she took. So that's Val Baker, that's Martin Val Baker, and that's Donovan there. But what's interesting about this photo, it's taken in St Ives, but it's a fake, it's faked. Because if you look at the date, it's 1965, and by that time Donovan has already become famous and had number ones in America and this country. And so he's trying to look like a downhill kind of beatnik, but really he's reenacting what he did 3 or 4 years earlier. So that's kind of quite interesting really. And there's some more stills from the film. It's an hour-long film that was shown on, I don't know, BBC, whatever programme. It's all sort of mainly shot in St Ives. So we're still talking about the folk scene down here. Now, basically when Donovan was down here and when the Beatniks were coming down, there were no clubs as such. I mean, the folk clubs in the 60s only really started opening in the mid 60s. And one of the most famous in Cornwall was called Piper's Folk, and it was held in this very room, which is one of the reasons why we thought it might be quite nice to meet here. So what's interesting, they opened in 1967, and it was May 1967, so it was some kind of anniversary this month. And on the night they opened, they had 300 people here, apparently. And the other thing, it was seriously popular. If you look, it was open 5 days a week, and they had the club running. So you can get a sense of how popular it was. And the the lady that organised it was called Brenda Wootton. She's the large lady on the left, and I'll talk a bit more about her. She's an interesting character. And the club itself is called the Pipers, of course, named after the standing stones that are on the road here, a little bit further south. As you can see, they're enormous, giant standing stones. We're about 15, 16 feet high. There's some modern photos I found on the internet. And you can just see, actually, in the second photo, you can see St Buryan Church spire. So that little speck on the horizon is St Buryan Church. There's some more photos of the club here. It looks like it had some kind of panelling on the walls originally, but that seems to have gone. But you can still see the same kind of rough masonry. In this picture is Whiz Jones on the left, who's the guy that was playing the guitar in 1960 in Trafalgar Square, the king of the Beatniks. And in the middle is Ralph McTell, who is a guy who became quite famous in the 70s as a folk singer. Had, I think, a number one with a song called Streets of London. And he had lots of connections to Cornwall as well. He used to travel down with the other Beatniks. And I'll come back to talking about him again. That's Ralph McTell. And that's the record that they made sometime, I think, in 67. That's what it looks like. And then, of course, Donovan, because of his links to Cornwall, by this time he was obviously pretty famous, going over to America, spending a lot of time with the Beatles. He ended up going, and shortly after this photograph was taken, he would have gone to the ashram with the Beatles in India and that sort of thing. So he was pretty famous by then, but he certainly came down here and played as well. And there's a photo of him playing here, and there's another one. And what was interesting, by 1967, of course, Donovan wasn't really a beatnik anymore. He couldn't pretend that he was a down at heel beatnik. But anyway, fashions were changing, and he was becoming kind of more psychedelic. But he comes down and he makes another promotional film in Cornwall in 1967. And this film was made by the guy that did all Jimi Hendrix's album covers and stuff.